My thoughts on Jimmy Carter. As everyone knows, former US President Jimmy Carter passed away today, Sunday, December 29th, at the age of 100. He turned 100 a couple of months ago in October. And there's a lot of talk about his legacy, about what it means, etc. Jimmy Carter is one of the most beloved former US presidents in recent memory. He is one of the most celebrated US presidents in recent memory. And I understand why. But I think we have to be honest about the legacy of Jimmy Carter. We have to be honest about the political career of Jimmy Carter. We can become so romantic and so romanticizing about these former US presidents that we forget the fact that they were still the leaders of empire. You can't be the leader of an empire and not be a war criminal. You can't be the leader of an empire and not be responsible for mass death. And this isn't just an abstract argument. Look at Carter in Central America. Look at Carter in the Middle East. Look at Jimmy Carter's actual legacy. Look at what he actually championed as president. There's nothing that we could say about Jimmy Carter as a US president that would be honest and would also make him anything other than a war criminal. Now, let's be clear. There are levels to this shit. Is he better than Richard Nixon? Yes. Better than Gerald Ford? Sure. Better than Ronald Reagan? Absolutely. But we're talking about the worst of the worst, or the best of the worst, or however you want to think about it. Stripping funds away, federal funding away from mental health facilities starts with Carter. It reaches its peak with Ronald Reagan, but it starts with Jimmy Carter. You see, Jimmy Carter was not the worst, but Jimmy Carter, like all these Democrats, are ultimately still advocating right-wing policies and right-wing ideologies. Let's never forget that. Now, what makes Jimmy Carter interesting is that, one, he wasn't a particularly effective US president. And, when you look at what happened in Iran, obviously the Shah being overthrown in 79 has a radical impact on Jimmy Carter's presidency and his legacy and how people think about him, right? You hear Jimmy Carter, you hear hostages. But unlike many of these other US presidents, Jimmy Carter had an afterlife that is considerable. No one other than maybe Barack Obama will have the opportunity to engage the world for such a long period of time after their presidency. George W. Bush has the opportunity. He was relatively young as a president too, but he's faded completely from the public scene. He has no interest in that kind of a thing. But Jimmy Carter leaves the office in 1980, right? Technically, 1981, January 1981. And he's not been president for 43 years. Almost 44 years. And he has built homes for the unhoused. He has really fought on behalf of poor people. He has tried to stop the worst excesses of the Israeli apartheid state. Jimmy Carter is a much better former president than he was a president, both in the sense that he just wasn't a particularly politically effective president, but also in the sense that he's a much better person. Jimmy Carter lived the 7-day gospel. Jimmy Carter was a devout Christian, and he absolutely believed in Christianity, and he absolutely believed in living his Christian principles every single day. I give him extraordinary credit for that. Jimmy Carter was a rare U.S. president. I didn't know Jimmy Carter, but I've interviewed Jimmy Carter. I've spent time with Jimmy Carter. And I found Jimmy Carter to be sincere, honest, principled. He has a white man shit with him. I remember one time Jimmy Carter told me, he was talking about Africa. He was talking about doing some important work in Africa. And he was talking about people being in Africa backwards. He used the word backwards. And I think he may have even talking about the jungles and being, backwards in the jungles of Africa before we came and saved them. Some real missionary shit. But at the core, he wanted to leave the world better than he found it. And I had deep love and admiration for Jimmy Carter because of that. I remember even asking Jimmy Carter once on a camera, so it wasn't like a private conversation, how he felt about gay marriage. And he said, I believe. And I said, do you think Jesus would approve of gay marriage? And he looked me dead in my face and said, absolutely. Or he said, yes. Jimmy Carter was something else. Jimmy Carter loved his wife. They were together 77 years. She passed away a year ago, I think November of 2023. And he lasted about another year, which is about how long I would have expected at the most that he would last after his beloved wife passed away. He's a special guy. She was a special human being. We got to be honest about that. But in the midst of celebrating Jimmy Carter as a wonderful, beautiful, sweet former president, let us not romanticize or sanitize his political legacy, which, like every manager of empire, comes at the expense of the vulnerable. That's it. Since you asked. Now, I also think it's kind of funny, by the way, just sidetracking note. It's kind of funny that he made sure he died before Donald Trump was president. Like, that motherfucker is not overseeing my funeral. That motherfucker is not. That's what I won't do. I will not. Yeah. I can't say I blame him. I'll be like, you know what? Wait, I got how many days? I'd be doing all kinds of shit to make sure I'm mad at his piece. Holding my nose, doing whatever I had to do, man. I don't want no parts of that. So now Joe Biden will be overseeing the funeral of Jimmy Carter. There's obvious jokes there, but I'm gonna be on my best behavior. What's Carter's position on civil war and invasion as they were during his time? What did he do to help or oppose Palestine and Lebanon? That's an interesting question. I mean, I talk about this in my book, Except for Palestine, that I wrote with Mitchell Plitnick. One, we have to be careful, right? Carter's out of office in 1980, so obviously 1982, he's not around. He loses to Reagan, which is fascinating. We could talk about that too. That's a whole other conversation. But when you talk about the shuttle diplomacy that was happening in the 1970s, and you talk about particularly Henry Kissinger's role in U.S. foreign policies toward Israel, you have to think really hard about Jimmy Carter and how Jimmy Carter intervened in that. You have to think about Jimmy Carter being the person who sits down with Sadat, Jimmy Carter being the person I'm so sorry. Jimmy Carter being the person who sits down at Camp David these camp, there are always these Camp David meetings or accords or whatever, in trying to create a land for, what do you call it? A land for peace, a land for peace deal. Jimmy Carter's ultimate goal. So I'm trying to type headlines at the same time. Jimmy Carter's ultimate goal was to prevent more war in the Middle East. He becomes president in 1976, 3 years after the October War, the Yom Kippur War. And that's when he says, okay, and that's the real first L Israel took, right? Obviously they won the 67 war, they won the 48 war. I mean, they lost. I mean, if you talk about the tripartite aggression of 56, over the Sinai, the Suez crisis, what I was trying to say. We could talk about that. Let me stay linear. But ultimately in 1978, Jimmy Carter brings Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat to the White House to talk about land for peace swaps. And this is how you get the basic framework for one of these major, not the first, but one of these major frameworks for peace in the Middle East, for peace in historic Palestine. Jimmy Carter did as well as anybody could have under those circumstances, given the limitations of not the format, but of the frameworks that are in place. In other words, the Camp David Accords of 78 were they still presumed that the United States was going to be inseparable from Israel. They still presumed that Israel was going to at least keep all of the land acquired, that it is, that all the pre-1967 land, and Israel showed no desire to honor the UN resolutions that should have returned the land acquired in 1967 back to the Palestinian people. And there wasn't a lot of pressure. There wasn't a lot of pressure to give it back for the United States. And we could talk about Kissinger being part of that, but there just wasn't much. This is when the right to exist discourse was really bubbling up. This was when it became important to acknowledge Israel's right to exist, whatever the hell that meant at the time. It wasn't just about territorial integrity anymore. It was about more. You could argue Jimmy Carter did create some peace. I mean, they literally won the Nobel Peace Prize. Begin and Sadat did. There was a peace treaty. This was important because if you think about the relationship between Egypt and Israel since then, it's considerably improved. Relations were normalized. All the shit, right? The Sinai, one of the things taken in 1967, was demilitarized. All of this stuff happens because of Jimmy Carter or because of the Accords. The problem is there was no commitment to the creation of a Palestinian state, the recognition of Israel's right to exist, which would continue to grow and intensify, and people were bending over backwards to acknowledge all the way up to the letters of mutual recognition, which happened right before the Oslo Accords. All of this stuff is happening. But the PLO still hasn't been recognized yet as the official representatives of the Palestinian people. That wouldn't happen for another 15 years. 15 years? Another 13, 15 years. Depending on how you think about the Oslo process. The shit wasn't going nowhere. There was a framework in place to make Israel look reasonable and the PLO to look recalcitrant, to me. So when you ask me sort of what role Jimmy Carter played, Jimmy Carter wanted the Palestinian people to have a state. Absolutely. Jimmy Carter wanted the Palestinian people to have freedom. Jimmy Carter wanted, it always says Carter had Israel give back the Sinai to Egypt. Yes, that was part of the negotiation. But remember, the UN Resolution 242 didn't say give back some of the land. It said, and I'm going to quote it to you. Let me pull it up. withdrawal of Israeli armed forces from territories occupied in the recent conflict. That meant everything that was taken in 1967 had to be given back. They didn't even give Egypt back everything they took from Egypt in 1967. Remember, Egypt didn't just lose the Sinai in 1967. They also lost what? Gaza. Syria lost the Golan. Jordan lost East Jerusalem.
Lost by Frank Ocean now playing.
Ooh, that scared the shit out of me. I ain't living right. Hey Siri, stop. Hey Siri, stop. Sorry, whatever I said.
Malcolm's Playroom.
Hey Siri, stop everywhere. Not that shit was about to start blasting my son.
Everywhere.
Allahu Akbar. That shit was about to start blasting Frank Ocean in my son's room while he's sleeping. Hold on, I gotta check his room to make sure he's not awake. From Siri, please. This is not what I need. Okay, he's out like a light. Snoring. So where was I? I was cooking too. What was he talking about? Oh, right. So yes, Jimmy Carter had Israel give back the Sinai. That's the land for peace, right? Then we could talk about why God, the whole Gaza thing. That's very interesting because nobody kind of really wanted it. But they're supposed to get back all the land. They didn't. But it set the stage for these peace treaties. 1979 with Egypt, 1994 with Jordan, and eventually Oslo. The problem is Oslo is trash. The problem is these peace treaties don't prepare for a Palestinian state. They've only prepared for Palestinians to live in a permanent second-class existence, to have Bantustan, and for Israel to become sort of normalized as the hegemon in the region.